what happens when a raw, untrained talent dares to challenge a world built on privilege and polish. When the old woman laid her fingers gently on the keys, the grand hall erupted in laughter. They didn't know. That sound was about to shatter everything they thought they knew. Meet Margaret Doyle, 55 years old, a self-taught piano prodigy from a forgotten neighborhood. Follow her journey as she walks the cold marble corridors of Juilliard, the elite music academy where, for decades, money spoke louder than music. When she's humiliated in front of a crowd by Clarissa Bellamont, heiress of a wealthy dynasty, who scoffs, "Don't touch what you can't afford." Margaret freezes, her heart trembles. Will she turn away quietly, or stay, and show them where true music really comes from? This story might just take your breath away. And maybe, just maybe, it'll remind you. Passion doesn't care about age, background, or status. True talent, if resilient enough, can bloom anywhere. Dear viewer, if this is your first time here, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a daily dose of real-life inspiration. Margaret Maggie Doyle lives in a modest apartment on the south side of town. She survives on a pension and a part-time cleaning job at St. Francis Church. A quiet place few remember, but to her it's everything. Because in its forgotten basement hall sits an old, dust-covered piano. Each quiet afternoon, once the pews are wiped down and the floors are mopped, Maggie sits at that piano, not chasing applause but something far deeper. Because music was the only thing that ever made her feel like herself. What Maggie didn't know was that someone had been listening. Thomas Hawthorne, a retired music teacher, once heard her play during a funeral. He couldn't believe his ears. No way, he thought. A woman her age with calloused hands, playing Chopin like that? With that kind of aching soul? He quietly recorded one of her performances and sent it, without telling her, to the Juilliard School of Music. A place where students wear cashmere, Steinways are the norm, and a single semester costs more than most make in a year. Weeks later, Maggie received a letter she never expected. Embossed on thick, cream-colored paper were the words, "Madam Doyle, we are honored to invite you to perform in our upcoming showcase for students and distinguished guests at the Juilliard School of Music." Her hands trembled as she held the letter. Juilliard. For someone like her? Then Mr. Hawthorne showed up at her door, looked her in the eyes, and said softly, "All you have to do is walk through the door. Let the piano do the rest." Maggie's apartment sat on the third floor of a crumbling old building, peeling walls, damp-smelling hallways, and windows that rattled when the wind blew. She lived alone, surrounded by a sagging bookshelf, a faded photo of her late husband, and an old radio that softly played classical music while she cooked her modest meals. The letter from Juilliard rested neatly on the dining table, a table usually set with nothing more than a bowl of lukewarm soup and a crust of bread. The paper was thick, smooth, embossed with the school's emblem, so beautiful it almost felt wrong to touch. Maggie sat there, staring at it, as if it were a train ticket to a world she'd only ever admired from a distance. "Juilliard," she whispered. The place where students called their professors maestro, where grand pianos were polished daily, and every performance was filmed with broadcast cameras. She looked down at her hands, bony, calloused, the fingers curled slightly from decades of manual labor. These were hands that had scrubbed toilets and polished marble floors in homes that weren't hers. "Dreamin' at your age, Maggie?" She chuckled to herself, but the laughter faded quickly into silence. And then she heard his voice again, like an echo rising from deep within her chest. Mr. Hawthorne's voice. Talent has no age, and these hands, Maggie, they deserve to touch the finest keys in the world. She let out a long sigh, then quietly opened a drawer. Inside was a small box filled with her most treasured things: a handkerchief embroidered with her husband Edward's name, a pair of earrings she only wore on Christmas, and, folded in half, yellowed with time, a sheet of music. Nocturne in C-sharp minor. The ink had faded, but she still remembered every note. She pressed the page to her chest, as if in prayer. And just then, the doorbell rang. It was Mr. Hawthorne, his silver hair neatly combed, his old wool coat buttoned tight, a warm smile on his face, and a brown paper bag in hand. "Brought some apple pie," he said, stepping in. "And good news, I just got off the phone with the academy. They're expecting you." "Thomas, I can't afford any of this." He shook his head. "Who said anything about money? Just bring the one thing they can't buy, the soul of music." Maggie paused. "I'm not sure I have the courage anymore." His eyes softened. "It's not courage, Maggie. It's justice. The world's ignored you long enough. Now, it's time they finally hear you." A glimmer flickered in her eyes, not from the sun, but from something deeper. The look of a woman about to step into a place she'd spent her whole life believing was off limits. She nodded, softly, but with a certainty that could change everything. "All right," she whispered, "I'll go." Maggie's old pickup truck rattled as it turned into the grand entrance of the Juilliard School of Music, its engine wheezing as if it, too, knew it didn't belong here. In front of her stretched a gleaming row of luxury cars: a black BMW, a white Mercedes, a silver Lexus parked just steps from the gate. Each one a polished monument to wealth and status. Maggie pulled her truck quietly to the farthest edge of the lot, hugging the fence, as if afraid her tires might scuff the pristine stone driveway. She reached for her fabric tote bag, a patchwork of faded scraps sewn together by her daughter the year before. Her coat was worn thin at the shoulders, the collar frayed. She drew in a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped out. The breeze caught her thinning gray hair, swirling it gently alongside the faint scent of expensive perfume from guests who had just swept into the marble lobby. No sooner had her foot touched the cobblestone walkway than a door nearby slammed open. A middle-aged couple exited a shiny black Range Rover. The woman glanced briefly at Maggie, then pulled her fur coat tighter, as if afraid the cold might carry a trace of poverty. The man lowered his sunglasses, gave her a blank stare, then shut the car door with finality, as though closing off an entire world that didn't concern him. She knew that feeling. Maggie walked slowly, the worn heels of her shoes tapping unevenly against the stone. She didn't bow her head, but her eyes shifted, careful not to meet anyone's gaze. She saw mothers in sparkling evening gowns, fathers in tailored tweed blazers, children fussing with ties in the mirror-polished glass. It wasn't just a music showcase. It felt like an audition for the next generation of high society. As she reached the grand staircase, a young man in a crisp academy uniform stepped toward her. Stiff collar, slicked back hair, a well-practiced smile. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you looking for the service entrance?" "I'm a guest," she said calmly, her voice steady. The boy hesitated, blinked, then quickly recovered with a forced grin. "Ah, of course. Please, right this way, through the main doors." She stepped through the towering glass entrance and into another world. Marble floors gleamed beneath the chandeliers, each light shimmering down on a space so vast it echoed the sound of breath itself. Every muddy mark her shoes left felt like a bruise on the immaculate surface. And there it was, at the center of the lobby, a black Steinway Model D grand piano resting proudly on a polished wooden platform, its lid tilted open, like a bird just about to take flight. But no one was looking at the piano. All eyes were on her. A woman with blonde hair, dressed in a plum velvet suit, stepped forward, her face composed, her smile perfectly measured. "Good afternoon. I'm Genevieve Winters, the event coordinator, and you are here in what capacity?" "I received an invitation," Maggie replied, pulling the letter from her fabric bag, holding it carefully with both hands. Genevieve glanced at the thick envelope, her gaze pausing as she read the words, "Referred by Thomas Hawthorne." "Ah, yes, Mrs. Margaret Doyle." The smile stayed, but the warmth in her eyes flickered and faded. "Juilliard is honored to welcome all emerging talents." She lingered slightly on the word all, as if gently reminding those who didn't quite belong. Genevieve handed Maggie a velvet-bound program, names embossed in gold: Lucian Fortner, Isabel Moreau, Clarissa Bellamont, each one a symphony of legacy and private tutors dressed in silk and possibility. Maggie took the program, her hands trembling just a little. Her name wasn't in it. She wasn't here to perform, just a guest. But then, her eyes landed on a small line near the bottom. Steinway Grand Model D, donated by the Bellamont Foundation, used exclusively for showcase performers. Her gaze drifted back to the piano, and for the first time since stepping into this cathedral of music and money, Maggie smiled. The sharp click of high heels on marble echoed like the opening drum roll to a performance she knew by heart. Conversations in the grand hall briefly faded as Clarissa Bellamont stepped in, her platinum blonde hair swept into a flawless chignon, a deep sapphire velvet gown clinging elegantly to her tall frame, and a thin Cartier bracelet on her wrist, hinting at generations of wealth. Behind her walked two fellow longtime academy students, and a personal assistant carrying a leather folio of sheet music, and a backup Hermes scarf, just in case. No introduction was needed. Everyone knew her name. The only daughter of the chairman of Bellamont Bank, Juilliard's most generous sponsor. They called her the Living Symphony, not only for her virtuoso command of the piano, but because every movement she made seemed choreographed, every step a carefully timed note in her ongoing concerto. Clarissa paused in the middle of the lobby, her gaze settling briefly on the Steinway Grand like a queen glancing at her throne. And then her eyes, whether intentionally or not, drifted across Maggie, who stood nearby holding the velvet-bound program, her shoulders subtly drawn inward amid the sea of wealth and polished elegance. In that single glance, Clarissa made a decision. This woman didn't belong here. She didn't need to ask who she was, didn't need a name. All it took was the worn-out shoes, the unstyled gray hair, and the faded fabric tote slung across her chest. "Well, how diverse," Clarissa said flatly to her friend, making no effort to lower her voice. "Is Juilliard accepting guests from retirement homes now?" Light laughter rippled from her entourage, just soft enough to avoid being scolded, but loud enough to leave someone feeling invisible. Maggie heard it all. She didn't react, didn't turn around. But beneath her sun-worn skin, a small muscle in her jaw tightened, not in anger, but in something far older. Familiarity. She knew that look. She'd seen it behind grocery store counters, in waiting rooms, at school events where she once stood in for her daughter. The look that didn't need to speak to say, "You don't belong here." Just then, Genevieve Winters approached, like a well-trained conductor responding to Clarissa's presence as the cue to begin. "Clarissa, so glad you arrived early. Mr. Lancaster is waiting in the rehearsal room. The Steinway bench has already been adjusted to your requested height." "Thank you," Clarissa replied with the composed smile of someone who had never been told no. Genevieve leaned in slightly and added, her voice low but pointed, "And don't forget, we have a special guest from the community joining us today." She nodded discreetly toward Maggie. "I noticed," Clarissa said, her tone feather-light, blade sharp. "Juilliard really is becoming inclusive." With that, she turned and glided toward the rehearsal rooms, her hair swaying in perfect rhythm with every step. Maggie stood frozen. Her hands clutched the program tightly, as if letting go would cause her to dissolve into the shining marble beneath her. Then, slowly, her gaze drifted, not toward Clarissa, not toward the people watching her, but to the Steinway, the piano. That was all she saw now. "We'll meet again," she whispered, a quiet promise, not to anyone else, but to herself. During the intermission, the concert hall softened into a quieter hum. Families strolled through the instrument exhibit and the Academy's image gallery, sipping chilled white wine, exchanging business cards, and trading the names of famous instructors the way others might discuss stock portfolios. Maggie slipped away from the crowd. No one noticed. No one needed to. She returned to the main atrium, where the Steinway concert grand rested quietly, like a wild creature at ease. There were no guards, no signs that read, "Do not touch," just a thin velvet rope draped loosely around it, a silent barrier between those who belonged and those who didn't. She stepped closer, her pace slow, almost reverent, her breath caught in her chest as she lifted a hand, not to play, just to touch. The tip of her finger brushed a key, cool and smooth like silk, a sensation unlike anything her old plastic keyboard at home could offer. Here, there was something alive. She closed her eyes for a second, and in that flicker of silence a single note rang in her mind, as if one more touch could change the color of the entire world. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice cut clean through the air, sharp, cold, unhesitating. Maggie opened her eyes. Clarissa Bellamont stood in front of her, arms crossed, gaze razor-sharp. At her side were her ever-present companions, lips twitching, their eyes lit with quiet amusement. "I was just looking," Maggie said softly, pulling her hand back as if the key had burned her. "Don't touch what you can't afford," Clarissa said louder this time, projecting her voice just enough to let the nearby crowd hear. A quiet laugh rose from the right. A pair of students lowered their wine glasses, curious. One parent nudged their child slightly back. The ripple had begun. Maggie stood frozen, her cheeks flushed red, not from anger but from something far more familiar. Shame, that old sensation from her youth, of being too poor, too small, too low to touch something beautiful. "I play the piano," she said, voice rough from holding back emotion. Clarissa paused, just for a beat, before tilting her head with a smirk. "Oh, really? Let me guess. Chopsticks? Or maybe twinkle on a thrift store keyboard." The laughter around them was bolder now, fuller. A cluster of students began to gather. They knew Clarissa only picked targets when there was something entertaining in it. Maggie tightened her grip on her bag and turned slightly to leave. "This isn't a community center, Mrs. Doyle," Clarissa added, her voice dripping with mockery. "Here, technique and class aren't things you can just borrow for the afternoon." Maggie stopped. Slowly, she turned back to face her, and this time her eyes didn't avoid anything. They were steady, heavy, wounded, but clear. "You know," she said, her voice low but unmistakably clear, "technique can be learned, but feeling, not everyone has that." Clarissa didn't respond. She didn't need to. A single raised eyebrow said everything. To her, that was just what people without talent told themselves. From across the room, Genevieve Winters began approaching, her brow slightly furrowed at the sight of the small crowd forming. "What's going on here?" she asked. "Nothing at all," Clarissa answered smoothly, already turning away. "Just a curious guest who got a little too close." Maggie didn't speak again. She quietly stepped out of the circle of stares and snickers, and as she walked away, no one noticed her left hand, trembling ever so slightly, not from fear, but from the kind of emotion that has no words. The air in the atrium thickened after Clarissa's final remark. The stifled laughter, the half-pitying glances, the uneasy silence of those who didn't want to be caught in the crossfire. All of it coiled around Maggie like an invisible noose. She turned away, shoulders trembling, not from fear, but from the wound. Once again, she'd been reminded that this place, this music, wasn't meant for someone like her. Then a voice rose, deep, calm, and yet carrying the weight of injustice bottled up over years. The sound of her playing once made me forget to breathe during a Chopin piece. Heads turned. Thomas Hawthorne, once one of Juilliard's most celebrated professors. For over 40 years, he had trained dozens of international award-winning students, his name etched into the Academy's history as the soul keeper of classical piano. But in 2011, he retired without warning. No farewell gala, no formal announcement. Rumors swirled, health issues, disagreements with the board, or maybe he had simply had enough. But only a few close to him knew the truth. Years ago, he had nominated a gifted student, black, from a humble background, for the honors program. The board rejected the application outright. "Does not meet admissions criteria," they said. The boy, Julius, left quietly. A few years later, Hawthorne heard he was working as a delivery driver, still playing piano, but never again on a stage. Hawthorne never forgave himself for not fighting harder, and since then he had searched for something else, not to right a wrong, but to reclaim a belief that had once been stolen. Then he met Maggie on a rainy afternoon, playing piano in an abandoned church. She didn't know he was there, standing quietly in the back, rain soaking his coat, afraid to interrupt something more sacred than perfection. That was the first time in years I'd heard a performance that needed no correction, he told Headmaster Rutherford. All it needs is someone willing to listen. And this time, he swore, he wouldn't let her go unheard. He stepped forward, placing himself gently but firmly between Maggie and the gawking crowd, not as a shield, but as a quiet line in the sand. "I want to be very clear," he said, raising his voice just enough. "This is Margaret Doyle, a woman with no formal training, yet the most musically gifted ear I've encountered in 4 decades of teaching." A few murmurs stirred in the background. A faculty member near the window tilted her head. A student by the refreshments quietly locked his phone. Clarissa kept her composure, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Is that so, Professor Hawthorne?" she asked, voice sweet but laced with venom. 40 years. And she's completely untrained. And never once needed a $1,000 master class to understand the sorrow in a nocturne, he replied without looking away. Clarissa smirked. "If you believe in her that much, why don't we let her prove it?" She turned toward the room. "After all, talk is cheap. A piano doesn't lie." The challenge hung in the air like a blade. All eyes were on Maggie now. Some looked curious, most looked skeptical. An old woman, a faded canvas bag, a church janitor, and now, about to sit at a Steinway played by international award winners? Maggie said nothing. She simply looked at Hawthorne, and in his eyes there was no pity, no forced encouragement, only trust, deep and unshakable. "If you don't want to," he said softly, "I'll walk you out." "No," Maggie said slowly. "I didn't come this far just to leave without touching the keys." She walked toward the piano. The crowd subtly parted, making room not out of welcome, but curiosity. Every step felt like it crushed 1,000 assumptions. About age, about poverty, about not belonging. Clarissa crossed her arms and stepped back, chin lifted as if preparing to watch a minor tragedy or a mildly amusing scene. Others hovered nearby, half intrigued, half unsure if they should start filming this odd moment. Maggie sat down. She didn't adjust the bench, didn't ask for help. She simply placed her hands on the keys, the same keys she'd been warned not to touch. A deep breath, eyes closed. "What is she going to play?" someone whispered from the back. She opened her eyes. "Nocturne, C-sharp minor," she said. Clarissa arched a brow. "Ambitious." "Not ambition," Maggie replied. "A promise I haven't finished." And then she began to play. The piano bench was slightly too high for Maggie, but she didn't adjust it. She simply rested her hands on the keys, hands thin and sinewy, the skin coarse with calluses, more familiar with mop handles, leaky faucets, and industrial soap than with the smooth gleam of ivory. She closed her eyes. For a moment, the world beyond her, the whispers, the footsteps, the heavy breaths of those waiting for her to fail, faded like mist at dawn. The first notes of Nocturne in C-sharp minor emerged, barely more than a breath. It wasn't a performance. It was a confession. The sound came not from a trained performer, but from someone who had known solitude, someone who had once heard the wind whistle through cracked windows on freezing nights too poor to afford heat. At first, the music was hesitant, like Maggie herself was asking the piano for permission to be heard. But after a few tentative bars, the sound deepened, grew more fluid, then began to unfurl, quietly, steadily, like ripples on still water. The hall seemed to fall into suspended animation. Clarissa, leaning near a column, didn't notice when her smirk disappeared. Her fingers tightened slightly around her purse strap, not from anger, but from a stunned bewilderment she couldn't name. Off to the right, a second-year student, a former international scholarship recipient, lowered his drink in slow motion, lips softly mouthing the melody, as if his body had forgotten how to stay detached. The music peeled back layers of emotion, sometimes as fragile as breath, sometimes piercingly raw. Maggie wasn't just playing notes, she was playing memories. Every keystroke held a story. The first time she touched an old piano in a church basement, The rainy nights spent memorizing pieces she heard on a crackling radio, the moment she sold her little keyboard to pay for her husband's hospital stay. Each of those moments now lived in her fingers. And Clarissa, for all her technique, for all the decades of practice, began to feel the weight of what she had never had. She had mastered precision since the age of 3. But the ache, the yearning, the stubborn kind of hope that crawled through every bar of Maggie's music, that had never been hers. "Oh my God," someone whispered, barely above breath, as if afraid to disturb the miracle. Even Genevieve Winters, who prided herself on neutral poise, had dropped her pen onto the folder in her lap. For the first time all day, her face showed something close to awe. As the piece reached its emotional peak, Maggie leaned forward slightly, her posture steady, her eyes still closed. Her hands, though slower than the younger performers, moved with absolute intention. Nothing showy, nothing wasted. She wasn't trying to impress. She was speaking in a language no one could fake. A girl sitting nearby began to cry without knowing why. Even Thomas Hawthorne, who had believed in her from the beginning, stood motionless, eyes glistening. He had taught so many students, helped so many earn their place on grand stages. But he had never seen anyone like Maggie, someone who played not for acclaim, not for placement, not for prestige. Someone who played simply to live one moment fully inside the music. When the final note faded, Maggie didn't move. Her fingers hovered on the keys for a few seconds longer, as if holding space for silence to settle where the sound had just been. And then came the first clap. It was Hawthorne's. Then another, and another, until applause erupted like a wave, rising from the floor and crashing through the walls. Maggie didn't rise. She only opened her eyes, and for the first time in years she knew. She had been heard, not as a cleaner, not as a misfit, but as an artist. Clarissa turned away, her lips pressed tightly together, her cheeks flushed, partly from shame, but partly from fear. When the final note dissolved into the air, Maggie remained still. Her hands rested gently on the keys, as if letting go would shatter the spell and pull her back into reality. A damp apartment, a modest kitchen, and an old electric keyboard missing a note. But then, boom! Applause erupted, sudden and fierce, no longer the polite, measured kind from earlier. This was real, raw, and from the heart. Some people stood, others wept. Someone even whispered, "I can't believe what I just heard." Seated in the front row, Adelaide Rutherford, the Academy's formidable headmaster, famously rigid and fiercely loyal to the European standard curriculum, didn't clap. But behind the thin lens of her glasses, her deep-set blue eyes shimmered. And then she nodded, slowly, deliberately, and that single motion shifted the atmosphere in the hall once again, from surprise to reverence. At that moment, Dr. Ellsworth Crane, a veteran piano professor who had taught in Paris, Munich, and Juilliard itself, stepped forward from the front row. He pulled his reading glasses halfway down the bridge of his nose, his gaze fixed firmly on Maggie. "Where did you study?" he asked, not with condescension, but with something that sounded startlingly like admiration. Maggie turned, her smile calm, the kind that only someone who had weathered life's harshest storms could wear without needing to prove anything. "I listened, and I learned," she replied, "on my own." The room froze. Clarissa stood off to the side, still and silent. Her expression didn't change, but her grip on her handbag tightened again. This time not in anger, but in genuine confusion. She glanced around and saw the eyes of professors who once followed her, now fixed on a wrinkled old woman with nothing but a tote bag and a lifetime of music in her bones. Unthinkable. Self-taught? Dr. Crane echoed slowly, like translating the impossible to himself. No sheet music? No formal instructor? Only ears and heart, Maggie said, then, after a beat, added more softly, and some very long nights. Not a single person laughed. Not a single person dared. Dr. Crane nodded. His expression betrayed what his voice had not: shock and deep respect. Adelaide Rutherford, whose silver hair was always pinned back and whose gray dresses never creased out of line, had long stood as Juilliard's living symbol of precision. Students regarded her like a marble statue, stoic, demanding, unreadable. As a student herself, Adelaide had once submitted a composition to an internal competition. It fused classical structure with folk themes, something unusual at the time. She was disqualified, not for lack of quality, but because the board declared it isn't traditional enough, and too emotional for a young lady. She swallowed that verdict and learned to play by the rules. From that moment on, she never wrote another note for herself. She became successful, but stopped playing for herself. And slowly, she became part of the system that once silenced her. But during Maggie's performance, as those worn fingers summoned emotions too real to name, Adelaide didn't just hear an elderly woman at the piano. She heard the echo of herself, 19 years old, dreaming of writing music that didn't need anyone's permission. Adelaide rose. Tall and austere, her charcoal gray dress falling perfectly to the floor, she walked toward Maggie with measured steps, her low heels striking steady notes on the marble floor. The entire hall held its breath. Clarissa swallowed hard. "Mrs. Doyle," the headmaster said, "in my 20 years overseeing Juilliard, I don't believe I've ever heard a nocturne quite like that." Maggie bowed her head. "I know I don't meet the standards of your academy." "No," Rutherford interrupted, "you exceed them." A gasp rippled through the audience. "I hope we can speak further," she added, then turned to Dr. Crane. "Your thoughts?" "I believe," he said, his eyes still on Maggie, "I've just witnessed what classical music has been missing for years: its soul." Applause broke out again, this time without hesitation. Students, both young and old, murmured to one another, "Will she be accepted? Is there a special scholarship? If this is self-taught?" Clarissa pulled out her phone, not to film, but to send a message. A few students nearby caught a glimpse of the screen. "We have a problem." After the performance, the atmosphere in the atrium felt entirely transformed. No longer thick with doubt or quiet judgment, it now carried the charge of something impossible having just occurred. Maggie remained near the Steinway, still standing on the small wooden riser. She didn't speak. She didn't smile in triumph. She simply stood with a quiet humility so steady, so grounded, that no one could look away. Headmaster Adelaide Rutherford and Professor Ellsworth Crane exchanged a brief, meaningful glance. Then Rutherford stepped forward, holding a thick folder that had been handed to her by an assistant less than 5 minutes after the final note faded. "Mrs. Doyle," she said, her tone still formal, but touched with something rare: emotion. "The Juilliard Special Academic Committee convened immediately following your performance. While our institution has never admitted a student of your age, we believe music does not answer to age or circumstance." Maggie looked up. "You mean We would be honored to offer you a special honorary admission, Rutherford continued, with full support, covering tuition, materials, and a custom class schedule. If you accept, Juilliard will be your home starting this fall. The room paused for a beat. Then, from the back row near the entrance, a group of first-year students began clapping. It wasn't prompted. It wasn't polite. It was real, moved. Then came applause from a few parents, then a fellow piano professor, and then, like a slow-building swell, the room filled with waves of genuine recognition. But not everyone joined in. At the far end of the hallway, Clarissa Belmont stood motionless, her lips pressed so tight they'd turned pale. Beside her was Victoria Langford, best friend and unofficial shadow. "A moving performance," Clarissa said, voice cool as ice. "And now, that's all it takes to get into Juilliard?" Victoria glanced around cautiously before leaning in. "They're calling her the Silent Star. A few faculty members are already discussing press interviews." "Perfect," Clarissa muttered. "So now, all it takes is a tragic life and a few heartfelt ballads to be celebrated. Years of technique, master classes, international awards, just erased by a church janitor." "But she really was extraordinary, Clarissa," Victoria said softly, her loyalty starting to fray at the edges. "You saw it. The room was in tears." "They cried for her story," Clarissa snapped, her eyes flashing with something sharper than anger. "Not for her music." The words were sharp, not as an argument, but as a shield, because deep down, for the first time, Clarissa was afraid. Afraid that everything she had believed, about talent being tied to pedigree, to wealth, to years of structured perfection, might be unraveling. Meanwhile, on the other side of the atrium, Maggie was escorted into a private tea room to complete a provisional enrollment form. In her hand was a Juilliard fountain pen, normally reserved only for distinguished honorary fellows. I'll really get to study here?" she asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. "Even though I don't fit in?" "You don't," Headmaster Rutherford said gently, her eyes shining with something rare and sincere. "And that's exactly why you're the first person in a long time who's made us stop and listen to ourselves again." At the door, Thomas Hawthorne stood quietly, his eyes misty, offering a single quiet nod. He had trained so many. He had watched countless students step into elite halls, but he'd never seen anything like this. A woman forgotten by the world, stepping onto a stage and silencing an entire academy with nothing but truth and music. "All you have to do," the headmaster said, setting the form down, "is sign here, and Juilliard will officially be part of your life." Maggie looked at the paper, then at her own hands, the same hands once told they had no right to touch a Steinway. She smiled, and slowly she signed her name, Margaret Doyle. Backstage, the hallway, usually filled with the faint buzz of tuning strings, assistants whispering and hurried footsteps, felt unusually dense today. Not from the heat, but from a tension wound tight like a piano string tuned too high, ready to snap. Clarissa Belmont moved quickly through the corridor, her heels striking sharp, deliberate beats across the dark wood floor. She had kept herself in check throughout the evening, the smile, the posture, the eyes, all perfectly curated in the image of a Belmont heir, just as she had been raised to be. But she couldn't hold it in any longer. Then she saw her. Maggie Doyle stood alone in the corner, holding a set of newly printed sheet music, an offering from Professor Crane as part of her scholarship award. She was smiling gently, a look as light as breeze, but her eyes held something deeper, something lunar, aged and unshakably still. Clarissa walked straight up to her. "That's enough," she said, voice low, but each word honed like a blade. "A touching performance, a fairy tale backstory. And now, a scholarship? A duet? What is this, music or marketing?" Maggie looked up slowly, unshaken. "I never meant to take anyone's place," she said, her voice rough but calm. "I just played." "Don't be naive," Clarissa snapped. "The entire school is talking about you, about the janitor woman who made Juilliard cry. They don't care how you played, they care who you are." There was a pause. "And that bothers you?" Magga asked, not mockingly, but like a breeze brushing past a flame. Clarissa stared at her, eyes filled with the weight of a lifetime built on perfection. "I've been training since I was 3, 6 hours a day. No Christmas, no summer. My father paid for private instructors from Vienna, bought me a Steinway, sent me to competitions from Europe to the U.S. "And you're very good." Maggie nodded, her gaze sincere. "Truly. But talent isn't a contest of who suffered more. It's something that comes from within." "Oh, so now pain makes great art?" Clarissa laughed, cold and bitter. "I don't need to suffer to play well." "No one needs to suffer," Maggie replied, her voice softening. "But when music is your only way out, it becomes blood. And blood doesn't ask how many hours you practiced. It just flows." Clarissa said nothing. Her expression didn't change, but her fists clenched slightly at her sides. The backstage door opened. Professor Crane and Headmaster Rutherford entered, followed by a young assistant. Both smiled, unaware they'd just interrupted a storm. "Clarissa, Margaret," Rutherford began, her tone warm but purposeful. "We have a proposal, and we truly believe it's an opportunity worth taking." Clarissa stepped half a pace back, eyes darting to Maggie, then back to the headmaster. "We'd like the two of you to perform a duet at the winter concert, held at the Royal Theatre. A Schubert piece for 4 hands." "No," Clarissa answered almost instantly. "I've always performed solo." "Exactly," Crane interjected. "That's what makes it a challenge. Schubert didn't write it for 2 identical artists. He wrote it for 2 different souls to tell the same story together. And we want to prove that Juilliard doesn't just teach technique," Rutherford added. "It creates connection across generations, classes, and the way we experience sound." Clarissa looked at them both, then at Maggie. The older woman said nothing. She didn't beg. She didn't provoke. She simply waited, not with hope, not with pride, just with presence. "I will consider it," Clarissa said finally, her lips taut. She turned and walked away, leaving behind a chill that clung to the space she'd vacated. When she was gone, Rutherford turned to Crane. "I'm not convinced she'll agree to this." "She will," he said, eyes still fixed on the door where Clarissa had disappeared. "Sometimes, the only way to save someone from drowning in pride is to make them sit beside a heart that's still alive." Practice room number 4 sat deep within the West Wing corridor, the most soundproofed space in the academy. No glass windows, no onlookers, just a slightly older Steinway than the one in the performance hall, but with keys that still glided like silk. Today, it served as the rehearsal stage for what many at Juilliard quietly called the most unlikely pairing in the school's history: Clarissa Bellamont and Margaret Doyle. Their first rehearsal began in silence. Maggie arrived early, as she always did. She lowered the bench just enough to ease the strain on her back, then sat and waited. Her hands rested in her lap, steady, but her gaze carried a soft weight. Inside her, a quiet tug-of-war unfolded, not just about music, but about worth. Part of her still harbored resentment, for the years of her youth lost behind doors that were shut before she even had the chance to knock. She once tore up an audition invitation at 34, on a night when her daughter had a fever and she had to choose between music and family. She chose family. But that night, and for many nights after, she dreamed of standing outside a concert hall, hearing piano notes drifting from inside and knowing she would never be the one playing them. Now, even as she sat inside one of the world's most prestigious music academies, she feared that if she played one wrong note, all of it might vanish like a late-coming illusion. Clarissa entered nearly 5 minutes later, holding a thick stack of annotated sheet music and carrying with her a deliberate frostiness. "I think we should begin from the development section," she said, her tone more like a directive than a suggestion. "That part requires absolute rhythmic precision. We can't let emotion warp the tempo." Maggie offered a faint smile. "Music doesn't always follow the clock, Clarissa." Clarissa took her place on the right-hand bench, fingers already poised like a competitor stepping into the arena. "That's exactly why some people win scholarships, and some don't." The words landed like cut glass, but Maggie didn't respond. She simply opened the score. She didn't need to study it. She had listened to this fantasia for years, hundreds of times, even if she'd never played it before. Those first sessions were tense. Clarissa hit every note with immaculate precision, each measure, each beat, crisp and calculated like a Swiss timepiece. Maggie, while technically accurate, would often drift. A little late here, a little held breath there. She slowed down on moments others rushed past, moments that, to her, felt deeply human. Clarissa grew frustrated. "You're dragging the tempo. I can't predict where you're going." "Because you're counting," Maggie said quietly, "not listening." Clarissa exhaled sharply, holding herself back. "We can't play together if we each follow a different method." "And we can't play together," Maggie replied, her eyes steady, "if there's only one method allowed." Clarissa said nothing, but that night, when she returned to the practice room to retrieve a forgotten phone, she paused outside the door. It was cracked open. Inside, Maggie was playing, alone, unplanned, unwatched. No performance, just a woman playing piano for herself. Clarissa stood still. She didn't interrupt, and for the first time she listened without analyzing. The next day, when Maggie once again lingered too long on a modulation, Clarissa didn't correct her. And then something strange began to happen. By the second week, Clarissa quietly suggested, "I think we should try aligning the refrain to your phrasing, just to see how it feels." They tried. The first attempt wasn't great, but it wasn't bad either. By the second, Clarissa began to notice something in Maggie's playing, something she'd never paid attention to before. A faint vibrato in the left hand, a held breath in the pedal, a slight tension that made the music breathe. "I never realized that part could sound so sad," Clarissa murmured, eyes fixed on the keys. "You've never played it while losing someone," Maggie said softly, then fell silent. From that day on, Clarissa started asking more questions. How do you keep the pedal from blurring the texture? How do you know when to cut it? And Maggie, in turn, began jotting notes into the margin, something she had never done in her life. "You use your third finger there, don't you?" Clarissa asked during one run. Yes, but don't be rigid. Let it fall gently. Don't strike it. Speak to it. By the third week, on an afternoon lit by sunlight filtering through the blinds, they finally played through the troublesome modulation section without error. Their hands overlapped at the keyboard, meeting, pulling away, and lifting the final phrase as though they were breathing in unison. Clarissa smiled for the first time. "That wasn't bad," she said, turning to Maggie. "You know, sometimes I feel like you're telling your whole life story through each note." "Because I am," Maggie replied without a hint of irony. "I play," Clarissa admitted, "so that people will recognize me." Maggie said nothing at first. Then, after a pause, she murmured, "When you stop playing for recognition and start playing because something inside you needs to, the music will recognize you." Clarissa looked at her, longer than she normally would, and for the first time her eyes held no trace of contempt, only curiosity. A fragile connection was beginning to take shape. The Winter Gala at the Royal Theatre was one of Juilliard's most prestigious events. Tickets had sold out 3 weeks in advance. The front rows were filled with music critics, representatives from elite arts foundations, and even an artistic director flown in from Berlin. Behind the crimson velvet curtain, a soft, golden spotlight bathed the Steinway grand piano at center stage. Clarissa Bellamont stood in the wings, quietly adjusting the sleeve of her icy blue evening gown. Her shoulders were square, her chin slightly raised, the posture of a seasoned performer, but there was something gentler now in her eyes. Behind her, Maggie Doyle took a deep breath. She wore a simple black gown prepared by the Academy itself. Her hands rubbed gently at her fingers, not to warm up, but to steady her nerves. "Do you always get this nervous before performing?" Clarissa asked, half teasing. Maggie smiled, though she didn't look at her. "I'm not nervous because of the audience," she said softly. "I'm nervous because of myself, because I'm afraid that if I fail, they'll say, 'See, she never belonged here to begin with.' And if you succeed?" Maggie paused, then shook her head slowly. "They'll say, 'How touching. What an inspiring story.' But no one will ask what it cost me to stand here." Clarissa turned to her, not as a partner, but for the first time, as an equal. "Then, tonight, we don't play for them. We play for ourselves." Maggie nodded, eyes glistening. "Are you ready?" Clarissa asked gently. Maggie looked at the younger woman, her expression tender but clear. "Never," she said, "but I'm always ready once the music starts." Clarissa laughed, quietly, her first genuine laugh in months, free of any mask. Then the curtain parted. The soft house lights dimmed, giving way to a gentle blue-white glow that washed across the stage. The audience fell silent as 2 women stepped forward, one young, poised, polished, bearing the Belmont name. The other, older, wiry, walking with the quiet steadiness of someone who had weathered many storms. They sat at the piano without a word of introduction. Just a score and 2 souls. Schubert, Fantasia in F minor, for 4 hands. The opening notes flowed out, light, clean, gliding like stream water through the roots of a forest. At first, Clarissa led, confident, defined, disciplined by years of elite training. Maggie followed, subtle, attentive, not pushing or pulling, but blending like a hidden harmony beneath the melody. Then came the center section, where their hands overlapped, weaving through each other. Maggie slowed the tempo ever so slightly, not enough to disrupt, just enough to make Clarissa listen. For the first time on stage, Clarissa wasn't controlling the music. She was in conversation with it. The audience held its breath. Overhead, the lighting softly highlighted Maggie's silver-white hair and Clarissa's radiant skin. Two ends of time speaking in the only language no one could question: music. One guest quietly wiped away tears. A music journalist set down his pen and simply listened. Professor Crane closed his eyes. Headmaster Rutherford nodded, slow and deliberate. As the final movement approached, with interlaced phrases that felt like farewells and long overdue embraces, Clarissa tilted her head ever so slightly toward Maggie. The look in her eyes was no longer that of a rival. It was gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, just enough for them to hear. Maggie smiled. When the last note was played, the entire theater rose to its feet. Applause thundered like waves crashing ashore, breaking and returning in wave after wave of unspoken praise. And then, as if fate had been patiently waiting, August Keller, director of a renowned European arts foundation, stepped onto the stage after the performance and handed Maggie his card. "Madame Doyle," he said in his rich French accent, "we would be honored to invite you to Vienna for next month's Voices of Silent Pianos program." The hall fell into hushed awe. Maggie took the card, then turned to Clarissa, who was looking at her with an expression no one had likely ever received from her before. "If you'd like," Maggie said softly, "I'll save you a seat beside me." Clarissa smiled, and for the first time it was real, open, unafraid. And just like that, on the biggest stage of their lives, two people who had come from opposite worlds became one. No one cared who was older or younger, who was privileged or poor. All that remained was the music and two souls who had finally learned how to listen. A year after the performance, Maggie Doyle sat on an old wooden chair in a modest studio in Paris, watching her students, children aged 12 or 13, from all walks of life, play their first notes. She had performed in Vienna and Prague, then returned to open a free music program for those who couldn't afford lessons, just as she once couldn't. Clarissa Bellamont's life had taken a different path. She still performed. She was still admired. But now her name was often followed by two words: "with Doyle." And she didn't mind. In fact, she felt proud. In an interview, when asked what had changed her approach to music, Clarissa replied simply, "I used to play to be seen. Now I play so no one ever feels unseen again." Maggie once said, "Not everyone gets to walk through the grand door, but sometimes all it takes is one person to believe, and the music will open the way." And you? Have you ever felt underestimated, judged for your background or appearance, and what or who helped you rise beyond it? Share your story in the comments below. Who knows? Maybe you'll be the reason someone dares to try again today. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe for more stories that reach all the way to the heart.